Thank you for joining us this morning. We appreciate it, or it might not be morning where you are, but welcome. My name is Sarah Reeves. I'm the marketing manager for New Society Publishers. We thank you for joining us today, whether you're in our Zoom call or viewing on our Facebook live stream, for our conversation with authors Lloyd Alter and Sami Grover on individual climate change versus systemic change. Please let us know where you're joining us from by commenting in the chat. We'd love to hear where people are living and coming to us from. So during the event, please also post any questions you might have in the event in the Q&A section. We will get to as many of those questions as time allows. We'll choose 2 people to win copies of Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle, and we're all climate hypocrites now from those posting questions. So don't be shy, get your questions in there, and you could be a lucky winner. Now, for the rest of us who may not win a book, it's a great time to be attending a New Society event, as our holiday sale is on now. So you can receive a 50% discount on Lloyd and Sami's books or any other New Society title, except for New Catalyst titles or books that aren't yet off press, with the code BOOKS50. So you just go to our website, newsociety.com, choose all the books for the chef in your life, the tree hugger, the future world leader, and you'll receive a 50% discount. And Brittany will put the code up in the chat for you, so you don't have to remember that. And if you want to keep up on any other events or great sales that we might have coming up, be sure to sign up for our newsletter. So in keeping with Indigenous culture and to build respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, we acknowledge that our office is located on the traditional unceded territory of the Sunemo First Nation, the keeper of this land since time immemorial. As settlers, it's important to recognize that although we call this place home, the Sunemo First Nation never ceded their lands to the Crown. An integral part of New Society's mission and vision has been to publish books for a world of change in a way that has minimal impact on our environment to help build a just and ecologically sustainable society. And for this work to remain authentic and meaningful, we acknowledge our settler privilege and understand the impact it has on the land and Indigenous peoples. You can find out more about New Society and how we put people and planet first at newsociety.com. So unfortunately, I can't think of a more opportune time to be engaging in this conversation, as I personally and the majority of New Society staff are located on the west coast of BC, where we are in the midst of navigating the effects of an extreme weather event, an atmospheric river that caused extreme flooding and landslides, a disaster of unprecedented scale resulting in mass evacuation, stranded travelers, and damage to basic infrastructure and transportation capacity, so severe that no one was prepared for it. And this is only months after a heat dome that sent temperatures into world record-breaking territory, resulting in out-of-control wildfires, which most definitely have contributed to the landslides and the flooding that we're seeing now. And the wildfires incinerated a whole town. So for many of us, the climate emergency has arrived. So I wish I could conjure up a cheerier intro, and I do think that our 2 guests today have the capacity and knowledge to shift us towards a low carbon future necessary to avoid catastrophic heating and maybe lift the mood a bit, and hopefully offer some tips on how to take care of one another in community now that the storm is upon us. So please join me in welcoming Lloyd Alter, a writer, public speaker, sustainable design instructor, former architect who has written over 14,000 articles for treehugger.com. He is convinced that we use too much of everything and that the key to sustainability is to simply use less. He is the author of the new book, Living the 1.5 Degree Lifestyle, Why Individual Climate Action Matters More Than Ever. Welcome, Lloyd.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
And Sami Grover is a green lifestyle blogger and self-confessed eco-hypocrite who has spent most of his life trying to live a greener lifestyle and written more than 2,000 articles on various ways to reduce our environmental impact, coming to the conclusion that each of us have to identify our greatest point of leverage and focus our efforts there. And he is the author of We're All Climate Hypocrites Now, How Embracing Our Limitations Can Unlock the Power of a Movement. So welcome, Sami.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Sorry, I was on mute. I didn't know that Lloyd says we should use less, but he's written far more. So I don't know what that says.
Well, thank you both for being here. Really appreciate it. And again, it couldn't be more timely. I mean, it's been timely for like 40, 50 years now, but you know. So Lloyd, you spent a year living the 1.5 degree lifestyle, which equates to slashing the average carbon footprint by 80%, which is what we need to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees. Why did you do it, and what did you learn?
Well, I did it for a couple of reasons. I've been writing for Tree Hugger now since 2005 and trying to figure out in my head where are our biggest problems from. And I went through this whole era that Sami did as well in about 2006 when British Petroleum started a whole advertising campaign where they didn't invent the carbon footprint, but they took the concept and they turned it to their own purposes, which was to basically convince people, you know, we're an oil company and we're just fine because it's you and you have to cut your carbon footprint. And they ran these campaigns that were troublesome in the sense of why BP was doing them. And for years afterwards, it was all, you know, carbon footprint doesn't matter. It was all a scam by British Petroleum. And it's not your individual actions that matter, but it's the oil companies. And they're the issue. And then in 2017, a report came out that was picked up by The Guardian that basically with the headline saying, you know, 100 oil companies are responsible for 72% of all carbon emissions. And I started thinking about this at the time. I said, well, oil companies make gas, make gasoline and all that stuff, but we're buying what they're selling. It's going in our cars and we're driving the cars that basically you can talk about production, but the real problem in the world is consumption. If you look at the carbon footprint of China, everyone says, China, China, China is the problem. But what have we done? We've offshored all of our production of stuff to where it's made in China. So that the size of the Chinese carbon footprint is basically representing our carbon footprint. Now, a group in Finland put together a proposal, if you started looking at this a few years ago, and they said, we have to turn this around and look at fully consumption-based accounting. Like, what is it that we are actually individually doing? And they broke their consumption-based accounting into a couple of categories: mobility, how we get around, nutrition, what we eat, housing, how we live, and basically buying stuff, purchasing stuff. And they looked at footprints of people around the world and found that basically a North American footprint is averaging at about 14 tons of carbon per year. The really rich 1% are sitting around 70 tons per year. My upper middle class lifestyle, I will estimate was roughly 30, 35 tons of carbon per year. But if you look at the IPCC report and what they say we have to do to be keep under 1.5 degrees, they set a target for 2030 that if you divide by the number of people on the planet comes up to 2.5 tons a year. So that's the 1.5 degree lifestyle, keeping your emissions under 2.5 tons a year. And half of the world now, the poorer half of the world, is doing that already. They are living in energy poverty. But the other half of the world, the rich half of the year, is way, way over their allotment. And even in that part of the world, it varies. If you live in a small apartment in Vancouver, which is serviced completely with clean electricity, and you decide that you're a vegan and you ride a bicycle, which there are a lot of people in Vancouver who live like that, and also in Montreal with all green electricity, you're pretty close to living the 1.5 degree lifestyle now without even knowing it. But as I found when I was on the radio with Alberta today, I was talking to them, well, what do we do in Alberta? And I said, well, you know, all of your electricity is made with coal, and you're all driving big pickup trucks, and you're all eating big steaks. You've got a real problem if you live in Alberta, just in the next province. So what I found when I started looking at it is that I basically did a massive spreadsheet and started analyzing and looking at everything that I do in terms of its carbon footprint. And first, it was really hard to find data. The data on it is so sketchy. The best thing I had was a book written 10 years ago in the UK by Mike Berners-Lee called How Bad Are the Bananas, which was, you know, I'm using British numbers. In Canada, they're not going to be the same, but it was a good place to start, a good guideline to start. And I started looking at everything. And what happens is you find that a lot of the things that people worry about are meaningless, like the plastic straws and things like that are little things. You know, you can get lost in the minutiae. And what you find is certain big things make a difference. And that's driving, that's flying, that's eating red meat, and that's living in big houses. And if you start just controlling those things and looking at those things, then you get very, very close to it. And so that's why, you know, as an architect, I started saying, okay, we have to live in more reasonably sized homes. We'd be much better off if we were living multifamily because you have fewer wall exposures. In my exercise, living in what is essentially a 1913 streetcar suburb where nobody used to drive, they used to get off the streetcar and walk to their house, meant that I could really live without a car very easily because I can walk up to the main street and I could get my bike and I could bike everywhere. And even though Toronto, where I live, has horrible bike lanes, they happen to have them all the way from my house to Ryerson University where I teach. And my daughter has the bike lanes all the way to where she runs a coffee shop. So if you're in the right place, you can do this stuff. I also had the great good fortune, if I was going to try and live a 1.5 degree lifestyle, of starting the project right when the pandemic hit. So right. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't get in an airplane. Everything was closed, so there was nowhere to drive. I mean, I think half of the country probably lived a 1.5 degree lifestyle through the pandemic, and we stopped consuming. And what happened when we stopped consuming? The global emissions went down 7.6%, which proves and all the airlines almost went bankrupt, and a lot of oil companies almost went bankrupt, which proves that the issue isn't production, it's consumption. If nobody's buying plane tickets, if nobody's driving cars, then these companies are in trouble and we put out less carbon dioxide. So that's where I really felt that doing this would make a difference. And ultimately, though, I don't know if I'm stepping onto Sami's field here. What I also found is that a million people would ask me, what difference does it make if you're one person? You know, what difference does it make if I do this? But I think it's like everything else. You know, I'm old enough to remember when we were boycotting California grapes, South African oranges, that we found that when people collectively made changes, then society changed. We saw this when everybody stopped smoking, that when the smoking thing was happening, what really changed smoking and stopped smoking is, I think, when the issue of secondhand smoke became possible. Because suddenly we didn't want to be sucking in somebody else's smoke. I think we're now in the situation that I don't want to be sucking in somebody else's CO2. That, you know, when I see a pickup truck, when I see a situation, I get personally angry about it. And I think we're going to be getting more and more people doing that. Now, the biggest problem is that 75% of Canadians live in car-dominant suburbs. So if they decide to do what I've done, it's really hard. Their houses are often leaky and they need a car to do just about anything. And that's the other place where it takes collective action, because we have to change the zoning bylaws, and we have to change the planning documents, and we have to change the transportation system so that other people can do what I was able to do because I was living in a community designed before there were cars. And, you know, that's the fundamental thing. If you live in downtown Vancouver or downtown Toronto, or in a small town where everything is close by, because it's a small town, then it's much easier to do than if you live in the suburbs.
Right. So location, that old saying, location, location, location comes into effect here as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's great. And you know, and it's interesting to reflect and maybe see some sort of a positive that came out of COVID that did show us that, you know, that unfortunately, as humans, we seem to have to be forced into a change, but that we can drive down emissions.
Well, it demonstrated the importance of consumption.
Exactly. And then you touched on something there that made me think of Sami's book in terms of, you know, in Alberta, the residents don't really have a choice where their energy is coming from, as being using coal. So Sami, in your book, We're All Climate Hypocrites Now, you agree that taking individual action matters, but you speak to the limits of our personal responsibility and the mediocre results of your own efforts in living a carbon-friendly lifestyle, and the need to think bigger. Why is living sustainably in our current system so challenging, and what do you think needs to change to make it possible and effective?
Yeah, so that's kind of that was the starting point for the book. You said it nailed the premise there. So where I usually start the story is this, that about 16 years ago, I vowed never to fly again. I was concerned about my carbon footprint. I was traveling a lot for work. I was actually flying to a bunch of sustainable tourism conferences, ironically enough. And I vowed never to fly again. I was going to quit my job. I had one last flight to take. And while on that trip, I fell in love with a woman on the other side of the Atlantic. And I have been flying regularly ever since, and feeling horrible about it. And I think a lot of people, I was looking in the chat, and I think this comes up in the chat a lot. I think that the challenge, and Lloyd and I think are on the same page with this, is that all of us who would like to move beyond a world of fossil fuels also have no choice but to live within a world that's powered by fossil fuels, right? And engaging with that world involves varying degrees of compromise with our values. So when I started writing the book, it really was an effort. You know, I thought it was going to be a book about why it's all systems change and behavior change doesn't matter, right? And it turns out that writing a book is a really good way to discover that you're wrong. What I discovered is that behavior change really does matter, but I think it matters for different reasons than we've been told. So I spoke to a whole bunch of interesting people in writing this book, including Lloyd. Lloyd is interviewed in the book, and all the folks who are leaning really heavily on the lifestyle change side of things still believed in systems change, and all the folks who I was reading who were arguing, well, it's systems change, it's systems change, it's systems change, a lot of them were vegans too, right? I don't think there is this. It's too often, you know, it's the internet age and we like to get mad at each other. It's too often sort of placed as one or the other. And what I argue, it's sort of both and, but we need to learn to embrace nuance and to understand why the actions we take matter. And that's where I think we need to be careful about carbon footprinting. I think carbon footprinting can be a useful tool. The reason BP loves it is because it allows them to shift responsibility. Right? If BP is talking to you about you ought to turn down your thermostat and ride a bike, they're talking about that because they know only about 5% of people are going to do that, and everyone else is going to carry on as normal. And it shifts the conversation away from a tax on gasoline or a banning of gas cars or all of these other systems level changes that can be done. So what I argue is it's less important necessarily to cut your specific carbon footprint to zero, although that is one strategy you can take. Instead, it's important to find the single most important place where you can shift the most amount of carbon out of the system, right? So for some, that really is like living the 1.5 degree lifestyle, I think is a very, very valuable strategy to take, particularly if you then write a book about it, because you're teaching people how to move in that direction. And you are also, what Lloyd did a lot, and we talk about this in the book, is he helps identify where you're sort of banging up against the system. Like you find those places where it's really hard. As soon as you start trying to live a 1.5 degree lifestyle, you suddenly discover that, oh, I don't live in a streetcar suburb or whatever it is, right? So there's that value there. But then equally, my position is we need a movement that's broad enough to bring in folks that maybe they either can't because of where they live or what their circumstances are, or quite frankly, they don't want to, right? I'm not actually that bothered if someone isn't ready to go vegan and they want to spend their time, protesting and stopping gas stations from being built. So that's where the idea of sort of hypocrisy comes in, is that hypocrisy is often used quite clumsily as either as a tool from opponents of climate action to discredit the movement, right? So you see that a lot. You remember when there was that oil tanker coming out of, I think, maybe one of the West Coast ports in the northern United States, and a bunch of kayakers kind of blockaded it for a couple of days. And every single commenter on there was like, well, those kayaks are made of oil. Those kayaks are made of oil. And it just drives you nuts, right? Because like, there's not a single person in those kayaks who doesn't know it. And Lloyd knows this, because every time you write about renewable energy, you get some asshole, excuse my language, but you get some fool in the comments that is saying, well, your computer is powered by coal. And, you just want to say, Jesus, I didn't realize. So there's this element of, one, disarm that attack from the outside, and two, try and calm down the sort of finger pointing inside the movement, because none of us have gotten to perfection, right? None of us are going to get to perfection within a system that sort of demands the opposite. And one of the interesting things around guilt and shame and shaming is it's not that they're bad, right? I actually talk about this, that I think guilt and shaming is very, very important. Right, they're useful tools. There's a lady called Jennifer Jackway, who is a professor at New York University, I believe. She wrote a book called "Is Shame Necessary?" I'm plugging books by other authors and different publishing houses, so I apologize for that. But buy it from your local.
All reading is good.
Right, but she talks a lot about this idea of shame being this really useful tool, but it's a little like antibiotics, right? The more you use it, the less powerful it becomes. So if we spend our time sort of lobbing it around willy-nilly at all of us for all our little failings, that's time not spent shaming Joe Manchin for being Joe Manchin, or all these other ways that shame can be used really strategically. And that's not to say we can't use it against individuals. To Lloyd's point about big trucks, it might be that's where shame makes sense, right? But shame works best on the edges of social norms. Right?
Yeah.
Guilt, we can all feel guilt. And actually, I feel guilt all the time. But shame works best on the edges of social norms. And that's where the smoking thing, for the longest time, it didn't work to shame smokers. It really didn't, because everyone was smoking. You watch Mad Men and, it didn't work.
Doctors would prescribe it. Yeah.
Yeah. Until all of a sudden it did work. Right. So it's watching those social norms and being strategic about where we use it without, but being, playing it through, right? Rather than just saying who's morally deserving of shame, let's think through every single time, like, what are we trying to achieve here? And is this the best tool for the job is kind of my argument.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I understand when you're trying to do these individual actions, and then, like you say, you keep getting sort of these roadblocks all over the place, and you can only do so much when those systems aren't in place to help you along the path. Like, I even remember trying to go plastic free, and I was stopped at the top of the wine bottle was coming out of plastic. And I was like, no. So you can try as hard as you can, and I think that's what's important as well. Is I've had people say, well, I can't do everything, so I'm not going to do anything at all, and that's not cool either, right?
And I'm sorry, one of the, can I just one other thought on that, because I think it speaks to Lloyd's point about boycotts too, right? Lloyd mentioned like boycotts against South Africa and the apartheid regime. It's a really interesting point, right? Because what those boycotts were used right back in the abolitionist fight in the 1800s. Those boycotts against slave-grown sugar, right? And those are very, very targeted and specific actions, and they are also accompanied by political mass mobilization, right? The challenge with thinking about avoiding fossil fuels as a boycott is that if fossil fuels are in every aspect of our lives, that can be very, very hard for a lot of people to do. So instead, it's like finding those really specific points, and they may be different depending on where you are. it's very easy, or not very easy, but it's easier to avoid flying as long as you don't fall in love with an American. If you live in Sweden, you know, if you live in Sweden or Germany, that sort of flight share thing can work quite effectively. And it doesn't have to be all or nothing. It might be just cutting down on your flights. But okay, sorry. I can talk about this all day.
Well, good. We have an hour. So we all know that I'm say COP26, the COP26 concluded on November 12th, with many saying that it was billed as the last chance to save the world from catastrophic climate change. And people are saying that it failed to make the radical steps that scientists said were needed, partly due to the last minute switch up from phasing out coal to phasing down coal. This question's to both of you. Do you think the commitments made at the COP26 were ambitious enough, assuming that they actually get implemented?
You want to go first, or should I, Lloyd?
Yeah.
We can probably do it in unison, I suspect. 1, 2, 3. Nope.
No. But the thing about it, and it's one of the reasons that I've actually become even more convinced about the importance of us taking individual action, because it seems that all of the collective action that we're taking is completely meaningless. Like, we vote for left-wing politicians who are supposed to kill, who then go and buy pipelines in Canada. We see them make everybody talking about net zero in 2050, which to me is completely meaningless. We've got a carbon budget that we have to keep under to keep the temperature from going over 1.5 degrees. We've seen in British Columbia in the last week what a climate disaster can look like. It's not, oh, we're in Canada, it'll be a little bit warmer and we'll actually benefit from it, as Joe Oliver, the former Minister of Energy for Stephen Harper, said in the paper last week. We're in a situation of rampant destruction that basically has stuck us right now back to 1850 in terms of not having a railway to the West. I mean, this is ridiculous. So to sit there and have policies that say, oh, we're going to do this by 2050, and we're going to keep putting carbon until we figure out some way to suck it out, I mean, it's worse than meaningless. It's dangerous. So that's why I become so emphatic about we all have to start now. We have to start now by taking individual things. We have to start now by lying in front of bulldozers if we have to. We have to start now by really getting angry with our politicians for not doing anything. We've got to be taking buckets of water out of BC and dumping it in their desks to say, we don't want this anymore. So, but I still believe that all this kind of stuff starts with yourself, starts with your own actions and your own positions. That every time I get on my bicycle, it's a political statement. And I really feel strongly that that's why individual actions matter so much.
Yeah, there's nothing I disagree with there. I think, sorry if folks are going to tune in for a debate, because Lloyd and I agree with each other a lot more than we expected. But my position is this, and I think you have to be really careful in how you talk about COP, because I think COP was utterly inadequate and always was going to be utterly inadequate.
Yes.
I think it's not true that it is our last chance, but I understand why people message it as that, right? I think because there is an urgency and we do need to get that urgency, but we do have the situation where we say it's our last chance, it's our last chance, and it's like, well, this one's our next last chance, right? What we know is that there's never going to be a point where cutting carbon isn't going to be a good idea, right? And what we also know is that COP26, what came out of COP26 is much stronger than what came out of Copenhagen.
Yes.
We know that, and we know the reason for that is the kind of grassroots pressure that's been building, which includes, it absolutely includes, what you describe as individual action, right, in terms of behavior change. It also includes that, the folks who've been divesting from coal, divesting from fossil fuels. There is a stigma beginning to be attached to the fossil fuel industry, and you saw that come out of COP. There's sort of significant promising signs of movement in the right direction, and there is also really depressing fact that is nowhere near far or fast enough, and people are dying right now. Right. So we got to be able to hold to those two things at once. And I don't want anything I say that says there are encouraging signs to not acknowledge that it's an utter disgrace that people who've done the least to contribute to the problem are currently in the firing line of, you know, rising sea levels and storms and all of those things. But, you know, that said, I do think there's been progress too, right? And I think the idea of saying reframing why individual action matters is really helpful because it is less about, we're not going to get to a position where suddenly, you know, the 10% of, you know, the wealthiest 10% on Earth voluntarily cut their carbon to a point where that is needed, right? That's not going to happen. But what we are going to see is a small contingent of those folks who cut emissions exactly the right amount in exactly the right places, come together with people who maybe haven't done that, and all push together on those systems to the point where those folks who don't care are also finding their carbon getting cut. So if you look at Amsterdam, people ride their bikes now not because they want to save the world. They ride their bikes because it's much faster and more fun than driving a car, right? You look at England, you turn the lights on and off, it produces less carbon than it does over here, and that's largely because of offshore wind and coal being shut down. There is the biomass issue, which I can talk about all day, being bullshit, right? Yeah, but they have had significant success in driving down, outside of biomass, driving down the carbon of the energy grid, right? And I hate to give Boris Johnson credit, but that part is true. Again, nowhere near fast enough, but there is progress being made in places, and progress is never linear. We reach tipping points and then we move over them. The one word of caution I would add around this idea that if we stop buying oil, oil companies go out of business. It's sort of true, but also oil companies are really good at using a crisis to get more money out of our governments, right? And that's why, you know, the idea of simply sort of starving them of money, that has to involve ending subsidies. It has to involve all of these other it has to involve divestment, which may be there are some folks who argue that divestment will have a larger impact if you divest your pension fund. And Lloyd, I know we've had some discussions about whether the actual numbers are correct, but it's an interesting idea that divesting your pension fund may starve oil companies of their revenue more than giving up your car, right? So my interest is in finding the places that are most effective, not necessarily the places that are most sort of individual. And it's about the metric of measurement rather than it is what you do, right? So if our concern is absolving ourselves because of our carbon footprint, I think that part is bullshit, right? Quite frankly, like, I don't care about your carbon footprint or mine. I don't care about your guilt or mine that much. What I care about is how much carbon can you personally move out of the atmosphere and into the ground, right? Either through avoided emissions or through bringing it back down.
So when it comes to action, like, I think about, you know, the science is clear and we need to get off fossil fuels like yesterday. So I was going to say this to why it's so hard for governments, but I think it's individuals as well to take action. So it's like we're told to believe the science around COVID and to follow all these rules because the science tells us to. But when it comes to climate change, it's like, yeah, we believe it's real, but hey, look, a squirrel. Like it's total disconnect. And like, it took our consumption to go down by being locked in our houses. And for the crisis to be like literally on our doorstep. And this climate crisis is, but we still can't seem to get it together to make the change. Now, is that behavior and psychology, or is it government being in bed with big business? Like, we know oil companies will be fine. They're already divesting to solar and renewable and all these other things, you know, and getting as much money out of oil as they can until, but it's just so frustrating that there just seems to be this lack of, like, I don't know, are we all so fragile we just can't look at it? But I mean, it's in our faces. So I don't know if you have an answer around the psychology of individuals or governments, but it just seems.
I think there's a couple of different things going on. One is that the oil companies have fought, and by oil companies, I'm really using that as shorthand. High emissions industries have fought really hard to have not just a seat at the table, but to kind of own the table. And they, you know, they absolutely have an outsized influence compared to, even if you ignore climate change and just consider how vital they are to our economies, they have an outsized influence on our governments, right? The other part is that there is this tension, right? Most people say they want climate action, But then most people also are going to have a hard time with some of what that looks like, right? If you tell them that it's going to cost them twice as much to fly home to see mom at Christmas, like that's going to be a hard pill to swallow. And I don't know if I have all the answers to that. I think it makes sense to start in certain places where we can build consensus, right? It makes sense to start with shutting down coal, right? Because that's a place where you can get a lot of agreement and where it's the highest carbon industry and all of those things. But at some point, we're going to have some tough conversations, right? There is folks that my argument is not against the folks who don't want to fly, right? I think it's great when people don't want to fly, but there is an element of we tend to start with the things that bring the most pleasure. And I don't know why that is. Within the environmental movement, I think we sometimes focus too much on sacrifice, right? And we think,
Yes,
okay, well, there's this flying to Greece for the holidays. That's frivolous. That's bad. Whereas actually, like, the most profitable part of flying for the aviation industry is business, right? That's business and business, first class travel, business travel, private airlines, private planes, all of those things are a good place to start because they're low hanging fruit. They're also most profitable. By most profitable, that means if you shut them down, you get this tipping effect that suddenly new routes are not as viable as they were, and you start seeing alternatives emerge. So my hope is that we can be more strategic about finding those sweet spots that are like, okay, here we can mobilize action. And yeah, we'll be talking to a bunch of hypocrites because we're hypocrites ourselves, right? We'll be saying, we don't want fossil fuels, and we'll drive to that protest. I've done it myself a million times, right?
there was a really interesting, Justin Trudeau made a really interesting Freudian slip yesterday when he was in Washington and talking about the issue of fossil fuels. And he meant to say Canada is a fossil fuel producing country. And what he actually said is Canada is a fossil fuel producing company. I mean, country, but, he's just like, talk about, the influence that the oil companies have on us. And that is really, really hard to break. But like when you were talking about psychology, I was reading an interesting study. For years, it's made me insane when they ask people what's the single most important thing you do to reduce your carbon footprint, and they answer recycling every time. And for years I thought this was because of the incredible effectiveness of the bottling and the single-use packaging companies which invented recycling in the first place, to convince everyone. But what this one study found was that recycling is emotionally and psychologically about the only thing that people can do that isn't painful and difficult and that they have to give something up. And so everybody does that, and they've actually themselves turned recycling into this heroic act for themselves because it's one of the few things that they have A, control over, and B, doesn't mean it means they don't have to really give anything up. So they give it much greater importance than it actually has, which is no importance at all in the larger scheme of things.
Yeah, it's interesting. So there was a mention in the comments about reframing, like where we're going in terms of reframing it in terms of the positive, right? I think Lloyd often does a really good job about this, right? It's like you read Lloyd's book and it's like his life sounds great. I want to be Lloyd, right? Like sounds really pleasant. 1.5 degrees lifestyle doesn't sound bad, apart from that I do occasionally eat steak and I really like steak. But right. But there is this element of, again, like Amsterdam is a really good example of that. Is a beautiful city, it's a fun city, and you can create these pictures of like, this is the society where we actually get to have more fun, where we get to lead healthier lives, where we get to have more time with our family, and if we can start in those places, I think that's a really good place. Once you start someone down the road of like, oh, I get to do this, oh, and then I have to give this up, it's a different beast, right? Like if we can talk about a 4-day work week, right? Like that's an easy sell, and that would be a great start, right? If we can get to a 3-day work week, 4-day work week, like lessening the desire for monetary gain and more time, and I'm forgetting who said this in the comments, but said, sort of more time with family and friends, more time relaxing at home, like all of those things, beautiful, right? And
20% less consumption per week, knocking off 1 day, 20% less oil spent commuting. And so, all of these things, there was also a comment that flew by, saying, well, you're an upper middle class person. What about people who don't have the money to do these things? And, 10 years ago in the last recession, they're all gone because of what happened with tree hugger over the time. We were all writing about frugal green living, that in fact, living a green lifestyle, eating less meat, driving less, buying less stuff, buying better stuff that lasts longer. All of these things are accessible to people who don't have a lot of money, and they save money. Yes, the rich will go out and buy the Teslas, and the rich will go out and buy the $30,000 ground source heat pumps, and other people can't do that. But we can still make choices that life is just as much, or as Sami says, more fun riding around in a bicycle. We can still eat really well. It's just making different choices in a lot of ways for some of these things.
Mm-hmm.
The only flip side on that is when we talk about when we frame our movement as a movement of individual behavior changes, I do have a concern that we're creating a movement that is hard to engage with if your carbon footprint isn't that big in the first place, right? Like, to some degree, that's that problem solved, right? But what do I do with that? Like, being an environmentalist means not flying. What do I do with that if I've never flown in my life, right? Being an environmentalist means not driving an SUV. What do I do with that if, I can't afford an SUV, right? Like, so there is that element of over prioritizing the individual sort of and by individual, I mean that bubble around your actual lifestyle, as opposed to everything's individual action, right? Going to a protest is individual action, signing a petition is individual action. But
yes,
but how do we move beyond? Yes, essentially the question of reducing your carbon footprint is a question for the wealthy, right? Like, that's just a fact, because the wealthy are the folks who have the carbon footprints.
Yes, exactly. Like, the top 10% of the wealth of the world, which includes almost everyone we know, it's 800 million people, they're 50% of the carbon footprint in the planet. And the other 50% aren't even, are living 1.5 degree lifestyles now. They wish they weren't. So this is the issue. This is a rich world's problem, a rich person's problem in a sense. And this is where I get mad about, everybody says the 1% or the 1/10 of 1% flying their rockets and being Jeff Bezos and that. The fact of the matter is, it's the huge mass of the 10% that is emitting the bulk of the carbon. The 1% is 15% of the carbon emissions.
Well, I would say that they're creating the problem, but it's actually the sort of the minorities that are dealing with the problem.
Well, yes.
Or being the most affected. It's the marginalized that are actually being the most affected by these behaviors, right?
Queen Elizabeth, no, it was King George during World War II, when Buckingham Palace got bombed, said, now I can look the West End in the eye, because they'd all been bombed flat. And, I think we're now in Canada, the rich world. We were exporting all the CO2 problems to the low-lying countries, to the Maldives, to the islands that are getting buried. We were exporting it to the poor South, all the carbon dioxide. But this, I think, in BC is this year, between the fires and the heat waves and the floods, are the first time that we're really looking the problem in the eye in Canada, and there's nobody else we can blame but ourselves this time. And so it's a really important point. We can't put it off anymore.
No, but we have a lot of questions coming in. And we have a lot of time. I would just say that, one thing that we've seen out of these disasters is community coming together. So there may be individual action, but when it hits the fan, shall we say, communities are coming together and helping one another. And I think that's a really key thing to bring together, that we can have this individual action that we do daily in our lives, but coming together as a community and creating organizations and groups that sort of move the movement along. And, instead of having to help one another sandbag our houses, we're actually, moving forward in direct action towards real change. So
Before you do the questions, I have to thank this last comment from Bob Willard, who has to leave, who calls us the senior version of Greta. I mean, I'd say Sami's sort of the middle version. I'm the senior version, but there we go.
That's wonderful. Before we get to questions, can you, each of us, just so we can, I think we've left with some really great things today, but if you had to say the 2 things an individual could do today just to take action in their lives, and Sami, 2 things that you think people can work towards to move systemic change in the right direction, just so we can leave with some kind of tangible tools for people.
2 things. Sure. Oh my. Okay.
Well, I mean, I know.
You go first, Lloyd.
No, you go first.
I know there's many more things than that, but we're running out of time.
Well, I can't say just, my first thought that bumped into my head was get a bike. And that's always the first thing I always say. But really the first thing I would say is read Sami's book and start thinking about the issue. Look at what you do when you go out the door and when you eat, and just be considerate and thoughtful about what you're doing in your daily life, and think about what could I do that had that was less of a problem. Does that make sense? I don't want to say, it's better than saying don't eat a burger.
I love the suggestion of buying my book, Lloyd. I'm actually going to counter that with saying buy Lloyd's book. And this isn't just us, just being gross and self-congratulatory. I think it's really interesting. Like, as a person who has no intention of living a 1.5 degree lifestyle until the government makes it easier for me, I still found it a very interesting book to actually, like, I think anyone can find those places of, like, it's a very, very useful exercise to go through and say, like, oh, okay, here are the 3 or 4 things that really make a difference, right? It's a really useful exercise in prioritization and in sort of understanding those systemic changes. But broadly, what I would say in terms of the couple of things you should do is, 1, find your superpower, right? And it sounds a bit cheesy, but find your thing that makes sense, that either you're interested in or you're particularly good at, and really lean into that. If you're really into composting, go all in on that and start a composting thing at your kid's school or your church or whatever, and then go deeper down that rabbit hole, right? If you're into writing, write a book. New Society Publishers will publish it for sure. But find that place where you think you can make the biggest difference. And then the other thing is, like, I would say, like, money's a great place to start if you happen to have any of it, right? And that means, 1, shift your investments, and 2, join an organization that is doing really good work on the things you care about, right? So I'm always going to push Dogwood Alliance because they're, I'm on the board and they're a terrific organization protecting forests in the Southeast United States. But you could go 350.org. There's actually, Bill McKibben has started a new organization that I don't remember the name of, that is actually working with boomers and the senior Gretas, if you like.
I really like that organization. Yeah. Yes, I've signed up for it and want to contribute to it.
Yeah, so
there's a lot of us.
Right. So moving beyond this bullshit idea that it's a generational struggle, but find those organizations. I think 1, think about your money. 2, find an organization and really dig in there and find your community. And 3, I get 3, right? Is your superpower. Find your superpower and really use that, and then buy Lloyd's book.
Awesome. And they're 50% off now with the coupon code books50 at newsociety.com. Okay, great. Thank you, both of you. We'll get to the questions here. The first one I have is from Keith, who commented on Facebook. So thank you to all of our people watching live on Facebook as well. His comment is, we live on a finite planet, yet our economic systems depend on growth, which ultimately includes increased populations with associated resource extraction exploitation. Can we make the necessary changes without tackling the need to change our economic systems? Can we continue to put economy ahead of ecology?
I'll go first and say there's a big movement mainly out of the UK called the Degrowth movement. And I call it, and I've been writing about it for years, as the sufficiency movement, which is, we all have to start thinking about growth. We can't keep having growth like this. And we have to rethink our economy, and it's a tough thing. When degrowth came to the United States, they were immediately called commies. I mean, that won't work here. It can't happen. Our whole economic system is predicated on growth. The degrowth movement is getting nowhere in North America, but it's something we have to look at more closely. How can we make our economy work without the growth? The population question that was raised is a completely separate issue. Worldwide, the population growth is happening in Africa. We do not have a population problem in the developed world. We have a depopulation problem. If you look at Japan, if you look at all of these countries, even China now, the population is actually shrinking. So we've got to keep those issues separate. But the degrowth movement, it's one of the things I'm really struggling to understand and deal with now, that if we do, as I recommend, stop buying, then what happens to all the people who are making money making? And fundamentally, I haven't worked that one out. But maybe Sami has a comment to follow on that.
My only comment is I'm not an economist. I think absolutely we have to tackle how our economy functions. I don't fully understand whether you can decouple growth from material consumption, right? Is that big question? Is that you can have growth in joy, growth in celebration, growth in being together, growth in love, growth in all of those things, right? If you can pay people to plant trees and do all the repair ecosystems, that to me feels like it's some form of economic growth too. So it seems to me that it's possible to at least shift the conversation away from growth for its own sake and move it towards growth in the things that matter, right? Growth in our, in our immense intellect and capacity for empathy and joy, right? And yeah, I agree. I mean, I think overpopulation is way oversold as an issue, and often is used as a dog whistle for other things that worry me a lot in terms of eco-fascism and racism and all of these things.
Yes.
So the problem currently is the wealthy and the privileged consuming too much, right? That's the problem, and often population tends to take care of itself in terms of when people are able to live a materially stable lifestyle, and have a reasonably secure opportunity for health and happiness. That tends to solve a lot of the if overpopulation is a problem, But I would just be very careful about that. And I would talk to a lot of people that know a lot more about it than me. But I think a lot of the groups pushing that idea of overpopulation as a serious issue have different agendas that are deeply sinister.
Totally agree.
And just a side note, not to push more New Society books, but we do have a subject category of New Economy, which includes a book called An Economy of Well-Being, and for government, the Happiness Policy Handbook. And did you also publish a book on indigenous economics, which I haven't read yet, but looked fantastic. Yes, that looked fantastic. Yes. I haven't read it yet, but it looks really good. That's Indigenomics by Carol.
Sarah, I want one for Christmas.
Okay. Have to order now because shipping delays. We'll get it in there for you. And this is a question I stumble upon all the time, where I think I'm making this great point, and then somebody says, but you drive a car, and you did speak a little bit to this, but Rob asks, what are some strategies that you've encountered for dealing with people who try to shut you down as a hypocrite? So, for example, look at those climate protesters who drive to the rally, like what you mentioned with people going to the protests in the plastic kayaks. Do you have a response? Is there something that we can use to sort of...
So there's a terrific online video. I forget the name of the comedian, but he, his response was like, oh, so that means climate change isn't a problem. Got it. Okay. So I think focus on the issue, right? Like it's not about my morality or your morality. If yes, I drove to this protest. Does that mean that the seas are not rising? Does that mean that the emissions are not growing? Like what does it have to do with anything? It's a little like saying, if I was to say that famine, the famine in Madagascar right now is a serious problem. And someone said, but didn't you just eat lunch? Like the two things are entirely separate. Now it is a valid question to say, oh, you're concerned about this. Could you do more in your own life? That's a valid question, but it doesn't take away from the fact that A, it's a problem, and B, certain entities have worked their tails off to maintain the economic systems and the profit models that are driving that problem. Like that's just an indisputable fact as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and also means like I've had somebody bring that up, and you're at a, it's like, okay, so since I can only get there in my car, then I'm not going to do anything at all. So it means no action taken, right? So, okay, so somebody has Kate on Zoom. This is for both authors. Can you please comment on this quote in context of your views? You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete, which is a quote from Buckminster Fuller. Not sure. Does that make sense? Are you able to?
Can you repeat it?
You can never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete.
Well, I would respond first to that none of us are living in geodesic domes, that Bucky Fuller, who came up with that quote, wanted to change the world. And in the end, a lot of sort of hippies in the 60s and 70s like me loved the idea of geodesic domes. And I had one and they leak and they fall apart. So if you're going to change the world, you've got to say, well, what do we have to work with? Do we reinvent the wheel every time, or do we take the knowledge that has been developed, say, by how do you build a building that doesn't leak and fall down and that you can hang a picture on the wall, and do normal things? Bucky is a hero of mine, but that quote, I think, is fundamentally wrong. You work, when I used to work full-time for the NDP in Toronto, I would go out and say, oh, we have to change this person's mind. And the rule always fundamental was work from your strength. You're never going to go get someone and get them to change their mind if they're totally set in another way. So I think we all have to work in some ways, in incremental ways, on building what we have, because if you try to tear everything down and start from scratch, you're just not going to have an audience. You're not going to have anybody with you. You're going to end up without any geodesic domes.
Yeah, I don't. Again, once again, I hate to agree with Lloyd, but I agree with Lloyd. I think that there's an element of we need to understand the movement as an ecosystem. There is a place for people building alternatives. There is a place for people showing what is possible, including radical efforts at utopia, including extreme efforts to live sort of 1.5 degree lifestyles or whatever. But also resistance is not just important. It's indispensable. And some of the biggest progress we've made has been in fighting against systems of oppression and exploitation. Right? Like I think the civil rights movement is one of the ongoing stories of our species, if you like. The fight against apartheid was a fight against something, and I dislike sort of negating those movements of resistance that have been really important. I think we could learn a lot from other movements that have been fundamentally oppositional.
Great. We have time for one last question, and this one is around education. And of course, change does start with our young people. So this is from Ellen. She says, formal education has traditionally focused on individual environmental actions and responsibility. If we recognize the importance of collective action taking, then how or where do we teach collective capacity and change-making skills? How should teachers be teaching climate action, in your opinions?
Well, this one, I think you're going to get completely different answers from Sami than you will from me, because he lives in a country where right now, like talking about critical race theory being banned in the schools when it doesn't even exist in schools. Education is so politicized there. But as someone who teaches, from a Canadian point of view, teachers will still be called sort of manipulative commies by the Parent Teachers Association if they start agitating for sort of major political action. And so that's, I think, why they have to tiptoe around it and talk about individual action instead of collective. And that's why at the university level, they invented tenure. So theoretically, teachers could be more radical and talk about system change, but that's all breaking down. So education for me is a real problem. I find that other full-time teachers at Ryerson University are in another decade completely. They haven't even figured out energy, let alone carbon. You know, they're teaching what they learned 40 years ago. So education is a huge problem in all of this. And it's been incredibly frustrating trying to actually deal with it at the university level. And it must be murder at the high school and public level.
Yeah. So yes, again, agree. I think I have a 9-year-old daughter and a 12-year-old daughter. I'm currently in a school that does teach about climate change a lot, has solar panels outside, and it's a publicly funded school in a red state, but in a very progressive town. And one, I do think
you should explain we're different. Red and blue are backwards here compared to
yeah,
red.
I'm sorry.
Red
yes,
means
and in the UK, yeah. So a Republican state, very democratic town. I think civics is a really important part of teaching this. So teaching about climate change partially just involves teaching about civics and democracy. And it's hard to teach democracy in a democracy that is close to dysfunctional, right? Or potentially fully dysfunctional. So the US, you know, we can talk all day about gerrymandering in North Carolina because it's insane. We're a 50-50 state, but we're going to have like 75% Republican representation. Teach kids that, and I tell them to ask why, right? And I think from there they'll figure their own. You know, kids are pretty good at spotting bullshit when they see it, and that's kind of where I start. I think teachers have to talk about politics when it comes to climate because it's an inherently political topic. It's about power and economics and policy just as much as it is molecules of carbon. How you navigate that in a system that is fundamentally designed and currently being fought to be controlled by a very, very explicitly political group of people that are taking over school boards. I don't know, man. I mean, like we got to get engaged, right? And I think it's probably the battle of our lifetimes is not necessarily even climate action. It's in figuring out how to protect our democracy. And if you've got answers, let me know how we do it.
Well, I think we could, this is such an important topic and we could talk about it for hours and maybe we can do this again. I'd like to thank both of you for spending the time with us and just really enjoyed it. And thanks to everybody who's joined us and we hope that you have gotten something out of it. And remember again to join our newsletter. Our sale is on till November 24th. With the coupon code BOOKS50. I'll announce the winners of the books, and I think we're going to do, since it is the holiday and all, each winner will win one copy of each book, so rather than just one title. So we have Kate Muir, you're a winner of 1.5 Degree Lifestyle and a copy of We're All Climate Hypocrites Now, and I'm pleased, hope I get your name right, Rian Fox. You are also one of our winners. So I'd like to thank Sami and Lloyd, and of course, I'd like to thank Brittany, who's behind the scenes, keeping the chat going and keeping us on Zoom and Facebook.
And hosting her parents while she's doing it, by all accounts.
And her parents, and thank you to Terry, Lynn, and John. And yeah, and just thanks to everybody. And somebody tell me if I'm forgetting something, but again, thanks everybody for joining us, and sign up for our newsletter so you know when our next event is. So thank you so much.
Thank you all. That was really fun.
Yeah.
Take care.